Hello everyone, my name is Kenia with Regatha Siahaya with the student ID of 224101073. And today I will be explaining about one of the top 10 OS, which is injection attack. Let's start with what is application security. Application security, or AppSec, is the process of identifying and repairing vulnerabilities in application software to prevent unauthorized access, modification, or misuse. And then what is OWASP? OWASP Top 10 is the list of the top 10 most critical security risks facing web application, compiled by the Open Web Application Security Project, which is an international nonprofit organization. Now, here are the top 10 of OWASP. There are from broken access control to mishandling of exceptional conditions. Now, I will be explaining about the fifth one, which is injection. So, let's learn about what is injection. Injection vulnerability is an application flaw that allows suspicious user input to be sent to an interpreter. It occurs when attackers exploit the vulnerabilities in an application to send malicious code into a system and allows them to execute unauthorized commands, access data, or manipulate the system operation. Now, down below here is the simplified version of what happens during an injection. The first one, they will identify vulnerable inputs. They will find input fields that are not properly sanitized. This could be login forms, search bars, or any field that accepts user input. And then they will craft those malicious input, such as in most cases, it involves special characters or even snippet of code trying to alter the queries of commands, like an SQL injection attacks, where the attacker will input SQL codes to manipulate the database queries. Now it will enter the query and then it will be executed. So when it is executed, the application will process the input and executes the unintended commands. And these commands will be executed and gives these attackers the data that they needed. Now, what are the causes of injection attacks? There are some causes. The first one is no input validation, which is no validation input process to make sure that the data given by users is correct by format type and limits set by the system. And then there are unsafe queries, which is a condition where commands to database is dynamically built with combining user input directly to the query structure without proper security mechanism. And of course, there are concatenation string usage, which is combining multiple strings into one, including attaching user input to the SQL query directly. There are some injection types, which first one is SQL injection, which is an injection that exploits database vulnerabilities through malicious SQL statements affecting data integrity and availability. And then there are some command injection, which is executes unauthorized commands on the host operating system, and an XML injection, which compromises XML explication by manipulating the process of XML data or documents. And then the last one is LDAP injection, which constructs LDAP statement based on the user input to exploit web-based application. Now these are just four. There are still many types, but I will only cover these. Let's see the example, which is an SQL injection. Now here, let's say that I am trying to log in into a web application. This is what we expect for how the server side will validate the credentials with an SQL query. It will change this query into my name, which is my username Kenia, and then my password. But if it is not sanitized, it will look like this. Like, let's say the attackers will input an SQL query like this, and then without sanitized inputs, the resulting SQL query would look like this. The query would return all rows from the user table, potentially allowing the malicious attacker to log in successfully as the first user returned. Now, what are the techniques that attacker uses? The first one is union-based SQL injection, which utilize union SQL to combine results to help them fetch data from different database tables. And then we have error-based injection, which is just forcing the database to generate errors to give them information. And then we have blind SQL injection with deduced data that one may send using payloads and observing the responses. And then we have second order injection, which is an input stored that looks harmless but becomes malicious when used out of context. And then some manipulated of parameterized queries, which is how the attackers will manipulate the parameters so the logic of database queries would be different. And then there is obfuscation techniques, which is using the Unicode encoding to cover their tracks. The injection attack risk can be financial loss, sensitive data security risk, account takeover, and loss of data integrity. How do we prevent this then? The first thing that we can do is to input validation and sanitation, which is sanitize the user input and validate the inputs by removing potentially malicious codes before executing. And then do secure coding practices, which addresses injection vulnerabilities. And then regular security updates to do security update regularly and audit to identify vulnerabilities in the system and keep system up to date with the latest security patches. And the last one is least privilege principle, which is giving user or system a strict access, minimum access needed to do each task and no more. So the conclusion is, one of the listed top 10 OWASP is injection, which is an attack that occurs when an attacker exploits vulnerabilities in a system that can be dangerous for sensitive data contained inside the system. This happens because of unsafe development practices such as no input validation or dynamic query usage, to which we can prevent by doing strict input validation, list privileged user, and prepared statement. Therefore, application security shall be an integral process during development to ensure safety, integrity, and trust in user. That is all that I can explain to you. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.